What makes Pokemon a Pokemon? It's whatever the Pokemon company releases.
I genuinely believe that I'm being gaslit, and I think this is a Digimon.
However, what do people expect in a Pokemon design? The Pokemon company has been one of the most popular creature collectors of the past decades, largely due to their initial Pokemania boom. This is why to a certain generation of people, Pokemon refers to the tendencies of the first 151 monsters. But by now, there are over 1,000 official designs, and Pokemon's design philosophy has changed. You can call me an artist, and I've been making STEM-based creatures and been working on an independent collector myself, and today I wanted to make some observations on the trends of elements that come and go in Pokemon designs. To further illustrate my point, I'll be drawing a design of my own using the elements I cover in each generation. There's 9 generations so far, so let's get started with the beginning. Gen 1 is the easiest to identify, mostly due to how long they've been around and how the roster was designed by a smaller team. The art director was Ken Sugimori, an illustrator for Game Freak back when they were still making video game magazines. At one point, the Pocket monsters were supposed to be about kaijus battling each other, and Sugimori would have to start drawing some monsters for the first time. According to an interview, the designs that survived these initial sketches would be Rhydon and Nidoking. Still, these wide reptilian faces would define many of Gen 1's monsters. But many does not mean all. Most character rosters are not defined by a single trait, or else everyone would look like copies of each other. Whilst there are some cooler, edgier designs, some would comparatively have to be sillier or cuter. On the Pokemon website, Sugimori said that he was, quote, designing from the perspective of a man, so he had difficulty drawing cute characters. Thus enters artist Atsuko Nishida, who worked on a previous Game Freak game. She will make the designs that ultimately gave Pokemon an edge over other rosters, as many of her cute designs were still treated to be cool and powerful in their own right, as opposed to the cuteness factor disappearing upon growing up. She made Pikachu, Charizard, all 3 starters, Vileplume, Poliwrath, Victreebel, and Rapidash, just to name a few. Despite the multiple revisions the in-game sprites had, these designs would be solidified by Ken Sugimori, who would draw each Pokemon and paint them with watercolor before scanning them to represent that this is what the species is supposed to look like. Wait a second, while looking through these, apparently he drew every Gen 1 Pokemon once for the original Red-Green release in Japan, but then he drew them again for Pokemon Red-Blue, which would be sold internationally. You can look these up yourself below, but I feel like the latter generally feels edgier, even though future interpretations will be closer to the original drawings of Pokemon Red-Green. These watercolor renders would stop by Gen 3, and even though a lot of these stock images are no longer drawn by Sugimori himself by now, many Pokemon fans still call this kind of official stock art Sugimori art. And these are the kind of stock images we'll be looking at for this video today. But let's focus on Gen 1, where we can see these triangular eyes with narrow irises, which Sugimori used for many of his human drawings. It's not the most used style, but it's something that's only used in these early gens. Many of Nishida's designs were using dark beady eyes with white glints on them, but why are eyes so important anyways? Well, it's one, if not the most important aspect of a face. Often you can see faces anywhere and it just requires the eyes and a mouth. In a study where they triggered a specific face recognizing part of the brain, people said that they saw specifically 2 eyes and a mouth. Pokemon's eye diversity would grow and explode in some generations as Pokemon aims to widen their definition, but for Gen 1, many Pokemon has had these slit irises and dark beads that wouldn't be as used in later generations. Otherwise, there was the level of detail they had in these 2D drawings where they drew every joint, had calf muscles, and drew rough scratches to represent texture. Mind you, when I point things out today, I'm not saying whether they're good or not, it's just something I noticed in these drawings. So with all that, let's try to make a Gen 1 looking creature. In 1815, there were reports of giant bones in the English Stonesfield quarry, which were acquired by English geologist William Buckland, where he and the team deduced that the bones must have come from some huge lizard, a Megalosaurus. By 1827, the name Megalosaurus buglandi would be used. In the following years, other species would be named like the Iguanodon and Hylaeosaurus, and by 1842, the term terrible lizard, Dinosaurus, would catch on to describe such creatures. These men and women weren't only geologists and biologists by now, they were ancient related studiers, paleontologists. Okay, that's enough etymology. Later, sculptor Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins was commissioned to make large concrete models of these dinosaurs in the Crystal Palace Park, which introduced the general public to these huge lizards. Alright, so here's a Megalosaurus-inspired Fakemon Megalosaur, drawn with the Gen 1 features with general splotches and patterns, where it's not expected that everyone in the species has dots in the same spot, but they just appear like that in the game because of technical limitation. Just use your imagination. Megalosaur is a water ground type, as Buckland initially thought that they would be amphibians. But as Buckland wasn't the commissioner of the statues, his initial findings would differ from this reconstruction, for the thigh bone suggested that the creature was upright. Game Freak wanted to capitalize on their ever-growing global Pokemania, so new sequel was ready to go only a year after the first games were open globally. And thus, there shouldn't be that big of a style change, right? Well, trust me, a lot can change in a few years. I think Gen 2 is simple. Sorry, simple is a very generic term. In this case, I'm referring to the patterns on the bodies, where there's often large open spots where you could slap your hand on them and not cause a single line or color change. Even aside from the babies, there's a lot of mons here with big blank spaces. Now, many Gen 1 Pokemon were like this as well, it's just that Gen 2's roster just feels proportionally more blank. And that's the thing we'll see today, where trends don't immediately start or end, but they gradually become more present or fade away, where the body patterns are much more dense in Gen 8, while Gen 9 relatively pulls back on him. The Crystal Palace Park was a hit with the public, but the models were so expensive that more weren't made. Still, the Dinotalk would only grow as more publications came out. French zoologist Georges Cuvier, who worked with William Buckland back in 1818, interpreted the Megalosaurus to be comparable to an iguana or a monitor lizard. And we see this interpretation drawn by Edouard Rieu in an 1863 publication where the Megalosaurus now looks fully terrestrial and pretty chunky. So here's Megalosaur. They're just a pure ground type now cause I don't see anyone calling them amphibious anymore. As for the design, I didn't want to just copy Totodile's face, right? But I got that tooth sticking out to reference the jaw fossils that's often shown in these papers. But things were about to change drastically. Okay, it's 2002, Pokemania's dying down. Director Junichi Masuda wanted the next game to be that much special and got stressed out to the point of needing to go to the hospital. Is the Game Boy Advance? There's more colors, more pixels. I've repeated the story in past videos. But the art would also change in this generation as well. I mean, sure, the pixel art now had colored outlines, but I'm just talking about the official stock art today. In this generation, every Pokemon, even the past ones, were redrawn digitally, and we can see how some past Pokemon were changed in these new drawings. It's not true for all of these mons, but we can see more detailed irises, rounder faces, and a more uniform style of shading. But personally, I found the colors of these digital drawings would be pretty muted until like generation 6 or 7. Pokemon is often known for appealing to various tastes, but admittedly Pokemon does fall more on the cute side. Many of Gen 3 and Gen 2's designs are quite round, keeping them pretty easy to draw, and the silhouettes tame. But the body patterns in Gen 3 are often more complex where large areas are broken up somehow, even by using thin outlines. Gen 3 is also our first explosion of different eye styles. In fact, the old triangular Sugimori eyes with tiny irises are kind of being phased out. Gen 3 designs also simplify body parts. Joints are often ignored or absent. Teeth are simplified with jagged lips. This didn't start with Gen 3 because we see a few mons do this in the previous generation, but it's a lot more prevalent here. I feel like this is a generation where many Gen 1 fans don't recognize these Pokemon as Pokemon.
The moon is a Pokemon now? That's huge.
But upon conversing with more fossils, the Megalosaurus may have been standing upright after all. Given the previously discovered thigh bone and looking at more complete fossils of the Eustrepospondylus and Allosaurus, by the 1890s, the new interpretation of the Megalosaurus would have them stand on 2 feet, and the tail dragging on the ground. By In Extinct Monsters by Henry N. Hutchinson, the Megalosaurus was described to be a predator like a cat who can pounce on their prey. Thus here's Megalosaur sporting a more feline body. A normal dragon type given how the latter type was used more liberally by the 3rd generation. Look, I'm trying to add some kind of element to these creature designs here, so gonna have to take some creative liberties at some point. Like Gen 2, this roster features a lot of pre and new evolutions, but this time, there's an emphasis on the latter. As mons have to grow, a lot of these creatures are rather chunky or fill the space in some way. My theory is that until the 6th generation, every Pokemon in the game were bound to a square grid of pixels. No design can exceed these dimensions. This is also why later Pokemon designs like Alolan Executor or Overquill would not have been conceived in these times, as they would easily exceed the square. Sure, fan artists in retrospect have found ways to make it fit, but this limitation is my hypothesis as to why these Gen 4 evolutions feel chunky. Gen 4 would also hold some of the edgiest designs of the franchise, not concepts, just designs in general, as we see darker colors and usage of more spikes and concave shapes to break up the silhouette. Speaking of silhouette, by the early 1900s, the Megalosaurus was recognized as a bipedal carnivorous theropod. As more bones were being found, if it looked like a theropod, it must be a Megalosaurus. Then how about these bones? Well, looks Megalosaurus enough. Unfortunately, the Megalosaurus was becoming something called a wastebasket taxon, where any similar looking species are just lumped in with each other incorrectly. Soon, we could lose what a Megalosaurus even means. So, here's Megalosaur themed around a trash can. You got me messed up if you think I'm drawing a wide-framed wastebasket. I don't think any Pokemon's that complicated with their patterns either. Poison Dragon type feels appropriate, though Poison Steel is very tempting. Should have probably had something else to break up the silhouette other than the random spikes, but otherwise the body was based off of a trash chute. But now it's time to talk about the next generation. So Gen 5 is the Great Reset, where these new Pokemon were the only ones you could see in the games until you finish the main story. Which means there had to be a lot of new mons. I have a whole video on how these roughly reflect the tropes in the first generation, but to compare these with Gen 1, I mean, what can I say? We just see the trends that we've been seeing ever since the third generation. Now, for some weird reason, I feel like Gen 5's roster feels dark. Like, there are some very bright and colorful designs like Lilligant and Archeops, but the dark grays of the roster kinda stuck out. I don't know, I felt this a little in Gen 4 with the darker colors, but here it's either the body is a dark color or the patterns are drawn with a dark gray highlight. I guess I noticed this because the color black is pretty strong, as a contrast with any color and sticks out. There's also a lot of diversity in the eyes, which indicates a further broadening of what makes a Pokemon a Pokemon. It do be in Pokemon's best interest to expand their definition of a Pokemon, because it makes future installments easier and makes their monopoly on the genre stronger. For any creature in a game could then be called a Pokemon.
Is it one level less than your Pokemon's high, or your monster's highest level? Yeah, it's like...
In the past, corporations didn't like their brand being a generic term as they lose their branding, but with Pokemon's litigation team, especially through Nintendo, I don't think they really worry about that anymore. Speaking of branding, is this the first time we're seeing these Dream World arts? Some call these corporate renders because, my gosh, do they use this everywhere in their merch. They're flat colored renders with very saturated colors. I can't go through all of these in this video, but I do know that they're still being made even though Gen 5's Dream World has been defunct for a long time. But I do want to point out Dream World's Pikachu, because, whoa, this might be the first time where we see this perfectly round shape for their head, which is pretty strong shape language, and something we'll see more of in the following generations. Through stricter definitions, the Megalosaurus was saved from being a wastebasket taxon, as older findings were reassigned to other species. In the 1960s, artist Neve Parker would illustrate the Megalosaurus as people understood it at the time. The tail no longer dragged on the floor, as the beefy Megalosaurus advanced with their thick neck in a horizontal pose. So here's a thick-necked Megalosaur, their dark rock type. In the 1970 movie When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, the Megalosaurus was depicted as a spiked quadrupedal lizard, even though it's been like 6 decades since evidence pointed at them being bipedal. But, oh well, I would end up adding spikes on this guy too to break up the blank spaces. Another massive change alert! Mainline Pokemon games are now 3D! So did that change anything? I would say so. I think the largest difference here is a simplification of textures. Tell me, without pausing, how many tufts of fur do you see in the following image? Okay, and try again with this image. Chances are, it was easier to count the second image. Previously, when you could just draw a zigzag of fur, now you need to specify how many tufts are actually there. For now, you need to make a 3D model based off of that image. How exactly are the feathers lined out? How do the wings actually work? Now don't worry, we see these ambiguous textures come back by Generation 8 as 3D art advances over the years. It's just something I noticed for these gens. Now otherwise, the color of this roster feels much brighter and more saturated in a way, due to the many pinks used to bolster the new fairy type. But we can make some direct comparisons in this roster. The Mega Evolution gimmick would define a good chunk of Gen 6's roster, and we can see that compared to their counterpart, that many of them are more saturated. Yes, a good chunk of Gen 6 designs are from a separate title from their main region, but I don't know if the design philosophy really changed between these two series of megas, especially when some of the ORAS megas were in the files of the previous game. As for body parts, despite Mega Evolution being about making a stronger, tougher Mon, we actually see a further simplification of their parts. Swampert's legs are now stumps, Venusaur leaves are now more even, Caesar's legs, Houndoom's toes. Now geometrical shapes like Mega Houndoom's open cuffs would be a nightmare to animate in 2D, but they're pretty easy shapes to make in 3D, despite having the freedom of 3 dimensions. I remember seeing these megas in the latest Pokemon game, Legends ZA, where nearly every Gen 6 mega still respect the confines of the preview window. But in contrast, many of the new megas of Legends ZA exceed the box greatly, either to emphasize their power and or because the battle system is quite different in this game. So speaking of megas, by the late 20th century, the Megalosaurus has been positioned to look like any other theropod. You know, like a T-Rex. They're still thought to be as large as a van, but they're not the largest theropod, you know? But here's the thing, after organizing the wastebasket taxon, there's not a lot of bones that can be confidently called Megalosaurus. In fact, to this day, the Megalosaurus fossil is very much still incomplete, including their face. Many suggest that the face is longer than the T-Rex's, but for my design today, I came across this image comparing the Carcharodontosaurus' skull with the Tyrannosaurus's. A narrower bite over a wider one. There's no definite evidence as to what the Megalosaurus' face actually had, but Dr. Scott Hardman's blog post wonders if they did have a narrower face. So here's Megalosaur as a cleaver. Okay, this is not what he was talking about, as the blog post also talks about longer snouts, but I had to work with something here. The cleaver aspect actually gave me a theme to draw around using metal plates and forked hands, but wanted to go with a very narrow shape to contrast with Tyrantum's wider face. This design's still Dragon type, by the way, and while I do wish I could fill out the blank spaces more, Gen 6 did have a fair share of blinker bodies. So anthropomorphized creatures were always in this franchise, but since when were there so many of them? In Gen 6, the starters were all humanoid, but Gen 7 would signal a lot of talk in terms of how humanized the monsters were. Not just the starters, as human characteristics are sprinkled across a good chunk of this roster. Now on the flip side, we have another set of gimmick designs with the Ultra Beasts, who are designed to not look like Pokemon. So yeah, if Pokemon truly didn't have a design philosophy, none of these guys would look out of place. But at the time, they broke the mold of what makes a Pokemon Pokemon by being faceless, too human, or too anatomically inconsistent with the beings we know on Earth. But something I find endearing about the Ultra Beasts is just how shaped they are. All but Stack Attack can be described with big triangles and circles. I just know because I've done so twice, and had fun doing it. Now I tried to do the same with the Mega Pokemon, but for some reason, I get tired of doing so pretty quickly. Maybe because they were based off of older designs, I just couldn't do them as easily, even if some were obviously shaped. But yes, Gen 7 uses a lot of strong shapes, almost harkening back to the very round shapes of Gen 3, at least in my observation. I almost forgot, there's another gimmick set of designs with the regionals. Can't glaze this idea enough, making old designs look different due to them adapting to a new environment, but in doing so, we can see a direct comparison. We see the same observations with the megas with more saturation and stronger colors. There's also clarity in the textures, for now they have to be directly translated to 3D models. Some designs change proportions, whether they're supposed to be cuter or cooler, but I think it's often the former for these regionals, with bigger eyes and heads. For this Megalosaur, I actually wanted to look back because, again, there's not a lot of actual Megalosaurus fossils. Granted, it is better than dumping any bone in to call it a day, but the first recognized dinosaur is still a mystery. You know, the funny thing is, William Buckland wasn't the first one to find a Megalosaurus fossil. In 1699, British scientist Edward Lloyd found a tooth which he thought belonged to a fish. But in 2002, this tooth was assigned to the Megalosaurus. But the records show of an older depiction of a fossil in 1676. English antiquarian Robert Plot was shown a rather large bone fragment. He would say that it was probably from the thigh bone of a giant human or elephant. But in 1763, the published caption for the fragment would call it the scrotum humanum, likening the bone fragment to a pair of testicles. However, the fragment would later be considered to be the end of a Megalosaurus femur. Megalosaur here tells the story of those two fragments by conjoining the parts with ectoplasmic goo. I know I'm highlighting more of a patella here, but I'm taking creative liberties, okay? Despite how ghosts and goo have been associated with each other in media a lot, I'm kinda surprised that there's no gooey ghost Pokemon as of yet. At least, I don't think there is. They're a bit anthropomorphized with the emo gooey hair, but otherwise, here's their incomplete fossil. As mentioned before, this is the generation where I noticed more dense patterns, like there's some color break or pattern on the body, or the space is too small that such a pattern would make it too cluttered. Again, not all Gen 8 Pokemon do this, but the vast majority is hard to slap your hand on without touching some color break. Also, we see some of the more complex texturing come back, at least in the stock art for Eldegoss and G-Max Sandaconda, where in the 3D models, they're just simpler. There's no harm in that. Older Pokemon had to go through the same thing when they were translated to 3D. So yeah, speaking of G-Maxes, along with the regionals, there's also another gimmick set of designs with the Gigantamaxes, or G-Maxes. They're pretty far removed from any other stock Pokemon image as they're emphasized with their lighting and perspective to show off their massive size, often tying to Pokemon they're referencing with something that's known to be big, like a landfill or a cruise ship. I don't know, it's kinda hard to compare apples to watermelons, but it is easier to compare regionals, which by some coincidence, many regionals this time around are very white. Now, whilst there's not a lot of color going on with the regionals, I don't think it's indicative of the decks as a whole, but I do want to note how the body shaping has changed by now. Look at Mr. Mime. What the heck, they are not even close! The body is now completely round. The face is one round shape, cheeks gone, fingers gone, cowls gone! This might be the biggest change between the different regionals, even if these were elements we've seen ever since Gen 3 with the simpler body parts and Gen 6 with the blockier body shapes. Otherwise, yeah, we're still seeing strong shapes in Gen 8 as well, not just in Galar but also in Legends Arceus, which is still part of Gen 8 and had 20 some new designs. I'll be BSing too much if I saw anything too different from these designs, other than how the color palette for Legends Arceus feels much more muted to fit the setting of an older Japan. I don't know, if I were to describe Gen 8 as a whole, I think we're now seeing complexity in body patterns and overlapping features, instead of complexity in detailing realistic joints and body parts. You know, there are new observations to this very day, like in the summer of 2024, where a quarry worker found dino footprints in southeast England. It ended up being the largest dino footprint site in the UK so far, in what is now called the Dinosaur Highway, and some of these prints were attributed to the Megalosaurus. So what if Megalosaur was a car on a highway? Steel ground type, by the way. I was mostly looking at the Dino Ferrari car, and trust me, I thought about referencing the Crystal Palace depictions again, especially with how Galar's about the UK and how their fossils are a nod to the Bone Wars and incorrect fossil reconstructions. But talking about the recent highway discovery felt better with the Megalosaurus progression throughout this video. I don't know, I just focused on adding patterns and using big shapes in this design, but I'd love to read what you think is indicative of the designs, especially the ones for the latest generations, where to me they feel more diverse and less cohesive. I initially thought Gen 9 was trying to replicate Gen 2. I know that every generation is trying to look like an older Pokemon to still make the designs fit in the world, but in one of the earlier trailers with Smoliv and Lechonk, I just noticed seeing these prominent blink bodies coming back again. Now, I don't think that's the case for the whole roster. In fact, it might be one of the most mixed bags yet, emphasizing sillier designs rather than cute or cool. But, I mean, we're living in this generation currently, and it's kind of hard for me to pinpoint honestly. See, there's that thing again with Pokemon trying to make anything look like a Pokemon, because as cute as Tandemaus is, I have a very hard time believing that this Pokemon could have been in the original roster, or else Sanrio could sue Game Freak, like how Sanrio was sued by Miffy by Dutch artist Dick Bruna. But the Pokemon Company is now quite a large one. If anything can be a Pokemon, then it's hard not to mention them when anyone tries to enter the genre. Anyways, Gen 9's official stock art would actually have some online discourse. Let's start with the Spricatito art. As a starter, they were shown in the trailers of Scarlet and Violet, but one artist pointed out that Spricatito's eyes look quite uneven, especially when you flip the art around. However, the artist would word their tweet a bit too harshly, something along the lines of, "Remember to always flip your art around," which is a pretty good tip for anyone trying to learn drawing visual art and practicing 3D shapes. But this sparked a wave of backlash, with artists chiming in with how the artists before the digital age drew without flipping their canvas, and the notion of you can draw whatever you want, however you want. I don't want to pull up names and tweets, but it's just something I lived through. A majority of these artists didn't even know this was about their official stock art, not expressive mind you, from a big company. But what's infuriating was that some people were telling the initial artists that they were wrong, and that the eyes were supposed to look like that because of the curvature of the face. The amount of gaslighting, I swear. And speaking of gaslighting, when the official stock art of Gen 9 came out, they felt weird. Like, we know that Sugimori no longer does all these stock arts, but dang, something looks stiff about these guys. They felt traced from 3D models. And my gosh, Twitter. Of course they weren't traced. How could you make a 3D model without drawing it in 2D first? Look, they drew the stock art in Gen 7 before the 3D model. And then you have takes where like, what do you mean they look traced? I don't see it. Again, I don't want to pull up any tweets, but when Pokemon Home dropped, where they've been posing every 3D model to reference the stock art, we can see that the official art of Gen 9 was traced. They fit so close compared to the stock arts of before. Who cares? You ask that now. There were people who denied this vehemently, calling others that they're wrong, not questioning the importance of the matter back then. But now that the definitive proof has shown that they are incorrect, they just say who cares anyways. You made me care. And guess what? That Spricatito? At first, I thought, wow, maybe someone in the company felt bad about this inaccurate stock art and decided to trace the model. This Spricatito's also traced. The body fits perfectly. Someone just messed up the job with the face, and you can see how the face was supposed to be. But apart from the trace work, I can see how a stock art is made after a 3D model. I mean, I've done so once before, where the only 2D drawings I had were the T-poses, so I had to draw a separate idle image after making the model. Though I didn't trace the model. And tracing your own model isn't the worst thing in the world, it just makes the drawing very correct. And comparing those arts to previous looser drawings kinda makes them stick out. I wonder if some Gen 9 designs were too complicated, like the nightmare that was Eternatus in Gen 8. But I don't know, I don't think the silhouettes are too complicated this time around, other than some paradoxes. Speaking of, other than the two regionals, the gimmick set this time around are these Paradox Pokemon, which reference specific older species, but other than feeling more saturated, they all kind of follow their own set of rules. Now Gen 9 would also have a Legends game with Legends ZA, but their all new designs are Mega Pokemon, which means that they reference older Pokemon and they're all supposed to be stronger or more powerful in some way. I mentioned how a lot of these exceed the boundaries of the preview box due to accentuating some element of their design, but otherwise, I don't know, I might talk about it separately in another video, though I'm not personally invested with this new set of designs. I think I'm having a harder time to grasp these designs just because of how recent they are, and they haven't had as much time to sit in people's minds, which is a luxury that Pokemon specifically can't afford. You know, back in the 1990s, there was a growing school of thought suggesting that some dinosaurs were feathered. This was due to the Archaeopteryx fossil having feathers and other claims of fossilized feathers coming out ever since. There are some amber claims that were proven otherwise, but there has been a more accepted claim from Lita Jing in 2016, who found part of a dinosaur's tail in an amber market in Myanmar. So, was the Megalosaurus also feathered? Bruh, we don't even know the full face of the guy. I don't know. But it is something to wonder about. So, here's our last iteration of Megalosaur. A dragon psychic type. Divine Bovine wasn't hard to find some element to tie into this design. I ended up going with a Megalomaniac vibe due to the Megalo name, but I don't know. Alright, so we went back and tried to make and trace a 3D model here, like the stock art of Scarlet and Violet. It turns out drawing the idle pose before a T-pose can easily make a lot of the proportions different. But then again, my 3D modeling skills are currently still pretty basic. I don't know if there's anything that different in my redraw here, as I didn't trace the model perfectly, and I just might not be noticing things because I've been looking at these for too long. But if you notice something different, I'd like to hear what you think. Otherwise, sometimes it felt like the most interesting thing about the Megalosaurus was its history with humanity, rather than any intrinsic value, as they now appear as just a regular theropod. But wow, what a history did it have. From the Scrotum Humamum to the Crystal Palace Park to opening humanity's eyes to dinosaurs. So those are my takes on how Pokemon designs have changed over time. If you disagree, please do so civilly down in the comments. I'd love to read other people's interpretations. This discussion was purely an exercise for this YouTube video, because personally I was starting to get frustrated with how I couldn't draw these Megalosaurids the way I wanted to. In fact, despite my attempts here, each drawing still has a bit of my own style, as they're each my own interpretations. And I'm okay with that. Everyone has their own preferences, myself included, so I won't tell you that you need to like every Pokemon. The franchise is built off of designs which appeal to different groups of people. In fact, I've come to distrust people, at least design-wise, when they say they like every Pokemon, because it then appears that they like the brand over any measures of their actual designs. I don't find it virtuous to love every creature design, because if that were the case, they should be accepting of so many other creature collectors outside of Pokemon. Like specifically, there have been so many indie creature collectors as of late. Ooblets, Cassette Beast, Kanomon, Moonstone Island, Beastie Ball, Aethermancer, which just came out last month. I urge you to check them out. But hey, these were just my observations. And with the Megalosaurus, we've learned how our perception can also change over time. It just depends on the hard evidence that you and others can accept. I'll be getting back on my grind, but if you liked the video, follow the channel. Shout out to my Patreon supporters for directly supporting me, but you can help me by just liking and sharing the video. I have no idea what that hype button does. But either way, thank you for watching this video, and I know that you will have a nice day.